Hello, and welcome to the next in our series of talks, The Quilt in Focus. This series coincides with the Quilt Echoes and Memories, an exhibition currently on display in Film Base, Curve Street, Temple Bar, Dublin. The exhibition itself focuses on the early history of HIV and AIDS in Ireland, as told through the Irish AIDS Memorial Quilt and the work of Gay Health Action. And on behalf of Queer Culture Ireland and our partners, Dublin LGBTQ plus Pride, it's a real honour to welcome this evening's panel, who will be discussing the work and legacy of Gay Health Action 36 years on. Right now, it is an interesting time to reflect on and highlight the history of one pandemic as we live through another. And as more people than ever now have a first-hand understanding of what it might be like to go through such anxiety and such fear. There are many similarities with this pandemic, but also there are many differences. So today I would like to especially thank Dr. Patrick McDonough, who brought our panel of speakers together this evening. And speaking of Patrick, if you want to learn more or read more about this area of Irish queer history, or more generally about other aspects of Irish queer history and queer studies, you can check out the resource list compiled by Patrick mainly. This comes from his extensive research and also contains resources from contributors across our Queer Culture Ireland network. The link for this will be available on Twitter, and Patrick is going to share it in the chat section this evening. So if you'd like also to add to this resource list, please do get in touch with us, because this is an evolving resource. So back to this evening. Our panel for this evening consists of James Grannell in conversation with Bill Foley, Cathal Kerrigan, and Ciaran McKinney, founding members of Gay Health Action, to reflect on their effort to respond to the HIV and AIDS war in Ireland and on the legacy of Gay Health Action. Despite their life-saving work, Gay Health Action's efforts are often overlooked, but there can be no doubt that they saved many, many lives in Ireland. This evening's discussion will focus on events leading up to the foundation of Gay Health Action in 1985, the media coverage surrounding HIV and AIDS in Ireland, along with the public AIDS education campaigns and support services instigated by Gay Health Action across its 5-year history. Gay Health Action was founded following a series of meetings at the Hirschfeld Centre and Trinity College Dublin in January and February 1985, attended by representatives from the National Gay Federation, Dublin Lesbian and Gay Men's Collective, Cork Gay Collective, Cork Irish Gay Rights Movement, Trinity College Dublin Gay Society, Tell a Friend, and Gay Information Cork. Over the next 5 years, Gay Health Action pioneered public HIV and AIDS education campaigns in Ireland. Their campaign, in contrast to the government, sought to promote safer sex practices, adopting explicit language in doing so. They went as far as offering advice on sexual positivity and discussing the joys available to people while still practicing safe sex. Their educational material includes the first AIDS information leaflet published in Ireland in May 1985, a Play Safe card, a condom card, AIDS information booklets, and a Joy of Sex poster. They disbanded in 1990, and shortly after this, Senator Shane Ross remarked that the heterosexual community owes a debt to the homosexual community in that the gay community, especially in Ireland, took the initiative on the AIDS problem. The gay community tackled this problem responsibly and presumably protected many in that community and many heterosexuals from the AIDS virus. And now to introduce our esteemed guests. Firstly, I would like to welcome Cathal Kerrigan, who uses the pronouns he, him. Cathal is a lifetime LGBTQ plus activist. He is a founding member of the Cork Irish Gay Rights Movement in the 1970s, as well as a founding member of the Cork Gay Collective, Dublin Gay Collective, and Gay Health Action in the 1980s. He was an active member of the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network and successfully lobbied for the decriminalisation of sexual activity between men in 1993. Also on our panel, I would like who's pro-Gay Health Action in 1985. During his time with the Gay Collective, he helped organise the 1983 Fairview Park protest marches and later co-edited Out for Ourselves, The Lives of Lesbians and Gay Men. He is also a founder of the Dublin AIDS Alliance, AIDS Helpline Dublin, and Corja. Currently, he is on the board of Gay Health Network and a volunteer with Empower. The third panelist I would like to welcome is Ciaran McKinney, whose pronouns are he, him. Ciaran was a member of the Lesbian and Gay Collective in the 1980s. The gay men's group established Gay Health Actions as Ireland's first organisational response to HIV. He was a member of staff at Gay Health Action with Mick Quinlan, Brenda Harvey and Ray Gaston, all of whom were funded through the Community Employment Scheme. They were guided and supported by the other members of Gay Health Action. He left for London in 1988. He worked for 15 years in sexual health services in London and with the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network as Director of Gay HIV Strategies from 2005 to 2009. He is chair of Gay Health Network, a sexual health program for men who have sex with men, and vice chair of Belong To, a national youth organisation for LGBTI plus young people in Ireland. He also manages the Engage programme at Age and Opportunity, promoting active citizenship and lifelong learning. And last but not least, I would like to welcome our host for tonight, James Grannell, whose pronouns are he, him. James is completing his PhD at the Centre for the History of Medicine in Ireland at the School of History in UCD. His research examines the work of HIV and AIDS activists in the Republic of Ireland from 1982 to 1992. It is such a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you all for your time, and thanks to our audience for tuning in this evening. Our discussion tonight is going to last about 40 minutes, and at their end, there will be room for questions and answers. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can add it to the chat on Zoom, or you can add it to the comment section on Facebook, and we'll try to get through all the questions we receive. So without further ado, it's over to you, James.
Thank you very much, Judith, for that really wonderful introduction. I thought it might be useful to start off the evening by giving a very brief history of the early period of HIV and AIDS internationally and the discovery of the virus. So I'll start by doing that and then open to the conversation with the guys. In the early 1980s, reports began to emerge in the US of a number of unusual illnesses manifesting in gay men. On the 5th of June 1981, the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report produced by the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, reported cases of pneumocystis carinii, a rare form of pneumonia, which was almost exclusively limited to severely immunosuppressed individuals, among 5 young, previously healthy gay men in Los Angeles. On the 3rd of July 1981, the New York Times published an article under the headline, "Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals." This article reported 41 cases of Kaposi's sarcoma, which had been diagnosed among gay men in New York and the San Francisco Bay Area. As all of these cases involve gay men, medical researchers hypothesized that they had resulted from a form of sexually transmitted infectious agent. However, other hypotheses at the time pointed out to the use of poppers in the gay community or repeated exposure to other men's semen as possible causes for the illnesses. The initial identification of these cases among gay men gave rise to the early term GRID, or gay-related immune deficiency. However, press reports at the time routinely and often used terms such as gay plague or gay cancer to describe this mysterious new illness. In response to this, gay men began to form activist and advocacy groups to address the health implications within their own community. The Gay Men's Health Crisis, founded in New York in January 1982, and the Terence Higgins Trust, originally the Terry Higgins Trust, which was founded in the UK in 1983, are 2 international examples of this. In light of growing epidemiological understandings of the illness, the term AIDS, or acquired immune deficiency syndrome, was adopted in July 1982. This change in nomenclature reflected an emerging acceptance that AIDS was not a gay disease. And at the time, it became associated with what were termed the 4 H's, which were homosexuals, heroin users, hemophiliacs, and Haitian immigrants to the United States. In May 1983, doctors working at the Pasteur Institute in France reported the discovery of a new retrovirus, which they termed LAV, or lymphadenopathy-associated virus. And they believed that this was the cause of AIDS. In April 1984, scientists at the National Cancer Institute in the USA announced that they had found the cause of AIDS and named their virus HTLV3. At a joint conference with the Pasteur Institute, They announced that LAV and HTLV3 were identical and likely the cause of AIDS. A blood test was created to screen for the virus, and at the time it was hoped that a vaccine could be developed in 2 years. In May of 1986, after much rancor between the French and American scientists, the International Committee on Taxonomy of Viruses introduced the name HIV, or Human Immunodeficiency Virus, which was used to replace previous terms LAV and HTLV3. In the Irish context, the first cases of AIDS were identified in the Republic of Ireland in late 1982 and were more widely reported in May 1983 after Deputy Sean McCarthy posed a question in the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, about cases in the Republic. The HIV antibody test was introduced to Ireland in late 1985. While this brief outline highlights the developments in scientific and medical understandings of HIV and AIDS, it was the initial association of AIDS with the gay community that became a dominant narrative throughout the 1980s. Responding to this narrative, gay men and lesbians organised to provide information and care within their own community. Tonight, we're very privileged to be joined by 3 of those men, so please allow me to open up the conversation. So, in 1985, the meetings at Trinity College and the Hartfield Centre took place, which led to the founding of Gay Health Action. And I was wondering, I think, Bill, you were at those initial meetings. If you have any memory of the reasons or why it was felt necessary at that time to form this group and where the group came out of.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things my memory is not great at is chronology, and certainly my memory of the dates of it are kind of clarified just by your history there. In sequence, I think the initiative for the Gay Health Action movement was really from the collective. So it was both Dublin Gay Collective and Cork Gay Collective, particularly after the collectives had split. And I think the collective in Dublin split in about 1984, 85. We did carry on to produce the book Out for Ourselves in 86. So that project continued and we were still in contact with each other. But most of our activism in the collectives was finished by then. And it was early days, my sense of it was in the response to HIV, because while there were some cases in Ireland before then, they were very few and largely, I think, connected with people who had come over from America or England to kind of effectively die at home. So there were very few cases up to, I think, about 85, when the first Indigenous cases began to be reported here, and that coincided with the launch of Gay Health Action. I think the collectives called the meeting in Trinity College with a view to kind of trying to share the response to HIV, rather than just coming from, say, the small left-wing group of the collective. It should have been a broad-based support kind of response. And as it happened, I think it was mostly the collective membership who then went in to be the face, if you like, of Gay Health Action. There weren't really any other organizations overtly involved at the time, which is my recollection.
And I wonder, and I think the 3 of you can kind of jump in on this if you want. At that time, what was the level of knowledge within the gay community around HIV and AIDS? So do you have any kind of, idea of that?
I think it was virtually nil. I mean, because I suppose we were activists, and a lot of us would have got subscriptions to magazines from abroad, like The Advocate and so on. So we were observing it from a distance, and occasional reports, and it seemed, it seemed like something completely fictitious initially, with all the names being applied to it. It was hard to understand whether it was a real illness or whether it was a conspiracy against, gay people, another way of slurring us in terms of calling it gay plague and so on. But it wasn't long before we realized that, if it's an infection, obviously it can be passed, and as that information began to filter from America, if it can be passed through sexual intercourse, it wouldn't be long before it would arrive in Ireland. And so we organized on the basis of that. I think we were probably in discussion in 84 about kind of providing information to the community. And when we did a leaflet, the first leaflet that we did in '85, we were bringing it around to the clubs and the pubs and so on and giving it to people. And there was some hostility against getting the information because people felt this is a strange, unusual infection that happens in America. It doesn't affect Ireland at all. And so we had a battle to persuade people that it would be of serious concern here. And then as numbers began to increase in Ireland, obviously that message became easier to deliver. But initially, the general LGBT population here had no real knowledge of it or understanding of it. There was just a number of us who were kind of activists who were tracing it, who had the information, I think.
And Bill, I'd like to add to that then as well, that it was one thing having information, but it was another thing embodying or using that information. And so I remember at one stage, I was auditor of Trinity Gay Talk at the time, as well as a member of the collective. But I met this American bloke in a bar, gorgeous guy. We went home together. We flip-flopped. And there I'm afterwards thinking, hang on, we've just been writing this leaflet about safer sex, and it really drove it home to me there and then. And after that moment, safer sex became my practice. But so I think it can be you can really you can underestimate the degree to which having knowledge and then putting it into practice really does require effort, and it needs to feel not just understandable, but really, really relevant and pertinent, So, and at the same time, we were trying to also avoid the scaremongering, messaging around it being contagious, and that you could, and that you actually had to avoid people who might look like they were HIV positive or indeed ill, So that's quite a complex message to firstly to transmit, and then for people to incorporate into their lives. So.
Yeah, and I'm going to switch off my video to improve because the connection is poor. I'd agree, Ciaran, because I was on a J1 in San Francisco working in the summer of 1983, and as I was it was a mind-changing event for me. I was at the Gay Pride, with 250,000 people, but even there in 1983, the summer of '83, it was only one table with information about what was called HTLV3 at the time, and most people, it just was, was a celebration. It wasn't like people would imagine today. So even though it had begun 2 years earlier in America, it was still very little. And I think that what happened as well is that a big influence, my recollection is, I could be wrong, but I come from Cork, as you know, so I was living in Dublin, involved in Dublin Gay Collective and that and things, but I was going back to Cork regularly, and when I go back, I'd meet up with Arthur Leahy, who was running the Key Co-op and the other place, the centre there. So I met up with him. My recollection is meeting up with him in about September 1984. And Rock Hudson had died. Now, Rock Hudson, for anybody younger, under 40 watching, was like a megastar. He was like the Lady Gaga, if you wish, of the time. He was huge in Hollywood. And he was a very stunningly good-looking man, but he was actually in the closet gay, though there were lots of rumors because he never married. And he died very publicly of AIDS during the summer. He had been able to hide it, but then eventually as it was physically visible that he was dying visibly, as his skin poured away and his body died out, he couldn't hide it. And the British tabloid media, who people would know of from Meghan Markle and things like that, they went to town on it. I just could not give you the obscene headlines they used about this. You'd have to go back and research it again to bring it up, but like things like, this man may have contaminated the waiter who served him his drink in the hotel. This man slept with men even though he knew he was infected 3 years ago, with the part. And talking to Arthur, he said, listen, what the British tabloid did, this is going to come here.
Yeah.
when the first case happens. Now, I know, James, you said that the first cases were recorded in 82, but that was medically. And I know you mentioned about the TD mentioned, but I don't have any recollection of that. It didn't get highlighted publicity. So there were, as Ciaran was saying, or Bill was saying, there were no Irish, prominent Irish people getting AIDS, and there were no people even in the gay community. Like even I didn't know anybody who was gay. It turned out afterwards that some of the people I knew did have AIDS or did have HIV, were HIV positive, but at that stage there was no test for HIV. So you only knew you had AIDS when you got the full-blown disease and you started developing illness. And in Ireland, nobody knew, but Arthur said, listen, we need to prepare. And that was the initial thing. And he said, look, will you talk to the colleagues in Dublin, which you did. I went back, talked to Christopher and Bill and Mick and Ciaran and the others. And that's how the idea started in the autumn of 1984. And then, as Bill said, we reached out. But sorry, I'm going on a bit long now, so stop me. But it also, it evolved over the, like I remember in January, I wasn't at the first meeting. I was off on holiday in Paris. And like you say, Ciaran, the thing that shocks me is that on that holiday, I had unprotected sex. So here I was helping to set up an organization. And I personally was, was the bottom, having unprotected sex, which was going to haunt me a couple of years later. But thankfully, I escaped. But the thing is that when I came back in January, in February, Gay Health Action was just one of 6 or 7 items on the Gay Men's Collective. And I remember in June, we then started doing research. We got the money for the leaflet, started doing a lot of design work. I can't remember who the name of the designer now, but there was a lot of work done. And by June, we had done the leaflet. We'd started going out. As Bill said, there were like people reacted negatively in the bars. I remember one person saying to me, "Oh, darling, what are you selling?" I said, "I'm trying to give you information about AIDS." "Oh, no, darling, we don't want any AIDS. We're not buying any AIDS tonight. Off you run." And it was that kind of, kind of jokey atmosphere. But we had gotten so involved and discovered there was so much work involved and that it was so serious that by June, we suddenly realized we weren't discussing the criminal justice bill. We weren't discussing the Release Nicky Kelly campaign. We weren't discussing the housing issue. The only thing on the agenda was Gay Health Action. So we became Gay Health Action. And that's what happened, I think. That it wasn't intentional that Gay Health Action was, the collective was Gay Health Action. We started it for everybody to be involved. But in fact, initially it was just seen as information and a bit of extra work on information.
And I think that's really an important point. At the time, there wasn't much information. At the time, people didn't know a lot about this in Ireland, and there wasn't many places that people could go to. And so that first Gay Health Action leaflet, it was actually given funding by the Health Education Bureau. But that funding then was refused for any subsequent. And I recall there was a particular article in the Irish Independent which took issue with the leaflet because it didn't advise against having sex, but told people ways to have sex safely. And there was a problem with this, and future funding was kind of refused. And I wonder what that kind of relationship with the Department of Health and the implications of not having funding meant for the group going forward in the production of their information.
Well, we used to organize, sorry, Bill, but we used to organize our own fundraisers because remember, sex between men was illegal. So we were told that we couldn't get public money to promote illegal activities. And remember also that condoms, guys, it was still illegal to sell condoms, wasn't it? So we were importing French stripe, red stripe condoms because they were thicker, and we were importing them from France. And we were running fundraisers to raise the money to buy the condoms to give them out free. So Bill, sorry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I mean, as you were saying earlier, Ciaran, I think it's a complex message that we were trying to deliver. That on the one hand, we were determined to keep the message sex positive. So we didn't want it to be interpreted as something that was condemnatory of the sexual behavior of gay men. And on the other hand, we had to kind of list what activities potentially put people at risk. And we had a series of meetings with the Health Education Bureau and doctors from there, and they were talking about, you have to tell people to stop being promiscuous, deliberately using that word. And we would have the discussion about it's not the number of people that you have sex with, it's what you do with them. And it was only over time that message, I think, began to be accepted by them. And in a way, it left them off the hook to give Gay Health Action the freedom to write in the generic language of the time, so we were deliberately using phrases like fucking and, rimming and all that kind of language, rather than the HSE preferred, intercourse and promiscuity. All those words were avoided. And I think what happened when they funded the first leaflet was they had the idea of that in theory in their heads. They kind of got it. But when it got out there and the backlash against the leaflet was so profound that they suddenly realized, oh my God, they're right, gay sex is illegal. What are we doing? And they came under a huge amount of backlash because of the funding of that leaflet, and the funding subsequently was refused. But I do think we did win the battle in terms of, sex positivity in the language, but the HSE themselves, or what was then the Eastern Regional Health Authority and the Health Education Bureau, were reluctant to put out information themselves because of that dilemma about being sex positive and also advising, how to avoid sex that was risky. So that balance was difficult to set.
But I think that's also when our we had started out with what we thought was a simple information campaign. We then became a very controversial political lobbying group because we discovered that Bill, I think you're being very, to be honest, I think you're being very generous to the professionals to some extent, looking back, because they were quite happy to get rid of their responsibility. And what we realized, and this is why we became naughty boys in a way and became unpopular, is that we had to force them, and we had to force the government to take action and to take up responsibility. We had to take the health board at the time, the HSE at the time, and try and make them to take responsibility, say, look, there are going to be people coming into hospital, this is how they need to have proper treatment. And when we started doing that, we were met with a deafening silence. We wrote letters, and Bill's former husband, who's died a couple of years ago, Christopher, was an expert at writing letters to, he could just pitch the tone that would just be perfect. He could, he would have made a perfect minister or politician because he had that perfect tone for being assertive and making the point without, whereas I would tend to lose the temper and lose the rag and be sort of get annoyed, get angry. He could keep control, and he wrote letters, and we had sent letter after letter to the Department of Health. We didn't even get the response of an acknowledgement. And it got so absurd. A year and a half in, I don't know if you guys recall this, but Brenda Harvey was a member of the Lesbian Collective, and she was involved in setting up Lesbian Health Action. But we decided there was first of all, we had a Fianna Fáil government, and the guy, I'm trying to remember his name now, but Hanlon, he was a member of the Catholic right-wing groups. So we knew we were dealing with a kind of a cold comfort. But then the Labour Party coalition government came in, and Barry Desmond, who was known to be sort of liberal, was the Minister for Health. We still got nowhere with the bureaucracy. So Brenda and I went down to his clinic one Friday night, posing as husband and wife outside. And when we got in and sat opposite him, we then introduced ourselves. Said, we're from Gay Health Action, blah, blah, blah. And he was very nice to us. We did get acknowledgements after that, but even then we still didn't get any change. And it was 87, the government produced a very poor information campaign. And we still had to lobby and fight. So even when they did act, unfortunately, they didn't act satisfactorily.
And I think one of the things that I found quite interesting looking through some of the material and archives was the sheer numbers of pamphlets and material that you were printing at the time. I mean, I just wrote down like a few of them from the mid-80s that in March 87, there was a reprint of the Safer Sex cards of 20,000 copies. And then in February 88, there were 22,000 Safer Sex leaflets published. And I think, were they being sold at times as well? They were being handed out, but were they available, some of the material, through Eason's or through some of the shops at one stage?
No, no, like certainly Eason's wouldn't have been distributing anything of that nature. At the time, we had some magazines that we used to try and get them to distribute, and even out for ourselves, they had difficulty getting that when that was published. But I think, like, as Colin is saying, it was a huge battle to get the government on board with messaging. And part of our message was, obviously we wanted services for gay men who were affected by HIV, but we also wanted to make the point that it's not a gay disease. It can affect everybody. And other groups in Ireland began to be infected. Clearly the haemophilia situation began to accumulate lots of publicity in those years, alongside, drug users, which was the major focus really towards the end of the 80s. At the time in the community, I suppose we were seeing people beginning to get sick, and there was that terrible thing of, going out to the pub one time and on Saturday night or whatever, and you're talking to friends, and people are saying, "Oh, did you hear about Joe or whatever?" And they kind of just disappeared from the scene, and months later you'd hear that they died, or you'd have a friend who got sick and disappeared away. And so there was a kind of weird decimation of the scene going on, that on some level was being covered by sociability of being out in the pubs, because it was talked about a little but not a lot. It was hard to get conversations going, I think, about for sex issues in pubs and so on. But there was a palpable fear around it, and I think that's what was driving people's hunger for information. So the initial resistance that we had seen in the early days of distribution information flipped around to people being hungry for it. So we were producing leaflets and sending them out. People were taking them up, appreciatively and so on. But it wasn't just the community; it was also educators, particularly, teachers and other community groups, were coming to us because the government wasn't doing anything. So our general leaflet on what HIV was and how to prevent it was taken up by schools and so on. And we organized education seminars later through the auspices of Dublin AIDS Alliance, which was deliberately kind of set up so that the government could talk to us without seeming to sanction an illegal organization in their terms. So we were giving seminars to teachers and community organizers about how to educate people on safer sex reduction and so on, including nuns, so we would end up in the bizarre position of kind of organizing safe sex workshops where nuns were present and people were talking about nipple clamps and so on. One member of the organization was particularly fond of talking about that as alternative ways for pleasure. But it was kind of fascinating to see the dynamic in the groups going on. And I have to say, the nuns were among the most appreciative of some of that information, because they realized that their teenagers that they were dealing with really needed the information, and they were happy to have it.
It's been my experience, sorry, Carl, for years that religious sisters have often been at the forefront of radical action, particularly in terms of social exclusion and poverty and lack of education. But I do think one of the other big challenges for us was, as we tried to develop collaborations, was that there was this binary between the innocent victims and people like us, like, gay men and drug users, and hemophiliacs, regarded themselves as innocent victims, and then children, of course, were seen as innocent. But that sometimes that was a huge challenge for people to actually get over that, we're all innocent. Nobody goes out looking for bloody HIV, and yet, so I think that, and that, I think that also led, increasingly to the stigma associated with HIV as well, So, sorry, Carl.
No, I'm just going to say that I suppose as well, to expand on what Bill was saying, I mean, well, individual nuns were very good. Orders and institutions, hierarchies were not.
Absolutely.
So it's important to make the distinction between the individual, exceptional kind of nuns who were on the ground dealing, and there was a huge injection of heroin addiction problem in Dublin, as Bill said, in the late 80s. And we ended up being the only resource for that community. So we ended up doing workshops. And as Bill said, we actually developed as well safer sex workshops. I remember doing some myself. Thai beads was another one I remember. And was the thing is that we were dealing with the actual mechanics of sex. Now, I've been reading stuff lately about, sorry, I'm going off the point now, going into modern times, but reading the stuff about young gay men and the fact that young gay men don't talk about masculinity, they don't talk about sexuality. There's nobody training you how to go about sex. That we didn't get it either. And I think I just throw it out there. It's one of the things that we started doing in Gay Health Action. We started actually holding workshops saying, how are we going to have, what's going to be sexy and safe? How can you be safe? And we started going into the nitty gritty, like literally you could use nipple clamps, you can use this, you could try this, you could do that, you could try this oil. Here's an idea. Here's a video that somebody did that might be interesting. And for young men today, I think we need, because I just want to mention this, disturbed by it, is the level of HIV infection in Ireland among young gay men, I understand, is rising as opposed to declining in the rest of Europe. Now, I could be wrong about that. You're more expert on it. But I think that that's one of those for Gay Health Action is one of the shocks is that we did all that, but we really need to find out what's happening today. But just one last thing, just say that the other people who helped us, there were lots of people like the students' unions. We did workshops for students and for the gay socks, etc. There was the trade unions were very supportive. And so there was a whole organization of people to change Irish society who were very supportive of us, as well as the people who in the authorities who were very cold and very unsupportive.
And it also just the number of women who rode in and became involved, mainly, I think from memory, mainly lesbian women, but not always, but women on the left. So, I would hate it if people thought that it had only been gay men who'd been mobilizing on this. It wasn't, and there was huge solidarity from women as well in this, so.
I don't depress things. Sorry, but I think one of the things that when I was thinking about it, one of the things that comes back to me, I don't know if you guys share this memory. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Apologies. Can you hear me? Sorry about that, folks. One of the things, I don't want to depress things, but I got very depressed thinking about it. Like 1985 to 1987 was a very dark time because we were researching and writing leaflets. We did 4 editions or 5 editions of the basic leaflet. And I remember the first one, we were sitting around, I think, Bill, I could see you and us sitting in the room talking about it and saying, well, what we're going to say, we got to tell people the truth, the facts, but we mustn't make them despair. So we ended up saying 1 in 10 of those who get HIV will develop AIDS, and 1 of 10 of those who develop AIDS will go on to die. By the time we got to the 4th leaflet, it was like everybody who gets HIV will get AIDS, and most likely, most people who get HIV AIDS will die. So that was the reality. And it was very depressing for us trying to deal with that as well and giving that message to our peers.
Yeah, I think as well, it struck me when you were talking about the sex positive message, and earlier you'd mentioned about condoms not being readily available. I was recently reading through some old editions of AIDS Action News, which was the newspaper that you published for a while. And it was interesting to see like an article in that talking about condoms and kind of teaching people how to use a condom. That it wasn't where now, you might assume that it's just kind of natural knowledge that people have. And, providing information on, well, try one on first and wank with it. And then before you use it during sex and things. It was very practical information that you were providing to people on the ground. I wonder, we talked earlier about, you'd mentioned about the fundraisers, because obviously funds were a huge issue for the group, not just to import condoms, but to produce these leaflets that were being sent out. And there's a particular fundraiser I think that always springs to my mind. Well, there are a few of them, but one of them that I always find quite humorous, I think Ciaran, you were involved in it, was the Alice Glenn Can Come Cabaret.
That was my favorite.
Yeah, so maybe if some of you could remember, and I think there was another one with the radiators from space played at it as well.
So for people in the audience who don't know who Alice Glenn was, she was the TD who was to the right of Attila the Hun, and so we from the office at Gay Health Action, we wrote to her inviting her to launch the fundraiser for Gay Health Action, and of course, well, not of course, but actually, at least their office had the decency to reply to say Alice Glenn wouldn't be available. So then we were legitimately able to call the cabaret the Alice Glenn Can't Come Cabaret, and it was held at the Project Arts Centre, and the Dice Man was the compere, and like I kind of thought that invoked the spirit of the time, that yes, things were shitty, but actually we could still have fun, and we could still, you know, be creative, you know, and show solidarity with each other, but and it didn't have to be completely doom and gloom, you know. So
Um, and the other thing I was wondering about was, Bill, you had said about forming the AIDS Action Alliance, and that idea of kind of forming alliances happened quite early, and trying to reach out to groups and bring groups together, and it's probably, and of course AIDS Action Alliance became Dublin AIDS Alliance, which then is HIV Ireland, so it's one of those successful years. But also, I think, were Gay Health Action involved in the early days of Corja, or had a relationship with Corja in the early days?
Yes. Well, I mean, as we were saying, the backlash to the first leaflet that Gay Health Action produced, really a lot of it focused on the fact that gay sex was still illegal. And we acknowledged that was a problem, obviously, for us, but we had to keep on working. And primarily, I suppose, we recognized that it was going to be a difficulty in terms of channeling governmental funds to us, even though we were successful, for instance, in getting the community employment scheme approved for Gay Health Action specific workers. Getting other leaflet funding was not possible. So, and also it tied into the reality that HIV in Ireland wasn't a gay specific illness and becoming more of a problem in other groups. And we wondered if making an alliance with the other groups would strengthen the case for government response and funding for services that were needed. So we came up with the idea of launching Dublin AIDS Alliance, which was an amalgamation of drug service support agencies and the Irish Haemophilia Society. And together, I think it was that grouping that produced Women in AIDS, for instance, and a lot of the street collections that we organised at the time were under Dublin AIDS Alliance banner rather than Gay Health Action banner, and the money was split between the organisations. So there was that kind of issue involved in the forming of the alliance. It was both to kind of recognize the reality and also to strategically deal with funding and public uh, public presentation of the issue. You know, I think in a few years, though, I mean, obviously there was concern that the virus was going to spread to the community, the heterosexual community, by the bridge of drug users. And it was extraordinary how I think that was one of the main catalysts to precipitate government response.
yeah,
Because they stopped thinking about it as a compartmentalized illness and started thinking about something that could blow up into the wider community as was happening then and has happened. And so they began to respond. And so huge resources were put into, say, the formation of drug task force, for instance. Methadone programs were introduced after years of battling within the drug service community for such services and so on. So things began to happen quite quickly within that. And again, the gay component of that became isolated because we were still illegal and still the funding was difficult. So the separate organizations began to make their own cases individually of the alliance. So the alliance kind of drifted away from its original purpose of an amalgamated lobbying front and became more of an advocacy group more generically for that.
And I was wondering, because I think it's an interesting thing at the start of the discussion. I mean, you were all members of the collectives, the Cork or Dublin collective. So it was largely this kind of sort of broad left leaning within the group. Did that ever, as a group, was that a hindrance or a help to you in different ways? And can you think of ways in which that might have played out the politics end of your work?
Well, I think it was a huge help. I mean, one of the things I try to promote in terms of the history is the role that Gay Health Action had in, or not Gay Health Action, sorry, the Dublin Lesbian Gay Collectives and the Cork Gay Collectives had in building a profile for LGBT community within the left. I mean, I like to think of it as a time when both people from the left of socialist leanings were for the first time discovering what the issues for LGBT people were because of our dialogue with them. And we were also putting our perspectives, both lesbian, gay, feminist perspectives politically, into the left. And it was a cross-fertilization of ideas. And when we came to, in the collective, building the Fairview March, we called out those organizations. So it was, you know, all of the left-leaning organizations were called before the march saying, you know, this is a really serious thing for us. You have to come, bring your banners, bring your supporters, and so on. And so it was that connection that helped us to build. And also our involvement in the first abortion campaign. All of us joined our local constituent organizations. All of us came out in those organizations. All of us raised the comparison with gay sexuality, lesbian sexuality, and, you know, women's right to independent control of their bodies. You know, all of the politics was feeding in, and we grew very close to it, made friends with people on the left and so on. So that was huge in terms of filling our venues, for instance, subsequently in Gay Health Action for the fundraisers, the concerts. There were mostly left-wing people who turned up for those and supported all of that. And politically, I think there was respect for where we were coming from within the established politics. I mean, it was known that people would respect the information work we were doing, but not necessarily be able to support it. You know, we did, of course, have our enemies. I'm not trying to denigrate it. I think Cathal has been very good about highlighting the fact that we were kind of pushed back by both church and state in terms of what we were trying to do, but we were also building alliances. And there's an argument to be made about, you know, the advancement of the cause of LGBT rights on the basis of how forthright we were at that time. In other words, HIV gave us a platform to talk about all these kind of discriminatory kind of issues that we had and built on the movement into the future. I think that was incredibly important.
Yeah, Cathal, you want to do?
Sorry. Well, I think, yeah, I think as well that our left-wing thing meant that from the very beginning, you mentioned gay men's health crisis in New York. We had to make a decision, and our left-wing politics meant we made a decision to go to build an information campaign that would put the pressure to get society to live up to its responsibilities. The alternative would have been to go, like Gay Men's Health Crisis, ended up setting up sort of hospital wards, ended up running whole hospital health services. One is that wasn't really feasible in Ireland because there wasn't that kind of philanthropy. But secondly, it was the government's responsibility, and people needed to be able to go to the health service. So we put the pressure. So it was our political analysis, which I think, like, for instance, I don't want to but I approached one person, one entrepreneur in the country, in the gay community, for funds for Gay Health Action in 1985, and that person said to me, "Listen, Cathal, you and I are political enemies. We may do the same thing in bed, but you know I'm a firm supporter of Fianna Fáil. I'm a member of TACA. You would have me. You would, you know, we oppose each other politically, completely. I'm not going to contribute to anything that's going to support, that's going to gain kudos for left-wing views." Now, to be fair, that person was one of the people who went on to found Fend for Friends, which is a very good organization, as a charity organization that does philanthropic work, practical stuff like getting beds, like getting support for people. But we could have gone down that road. It was our political analysis which led us not to go down that, I think. And that was very important factor that was very positive. A negative one would be, yes, that, I mean, obviously, motivating people to get involved with gay health action, because of the way I mentioned how it had sort of seeded the collective had seeded into gay health action. It was seen as as a collective kind of thing. So trying to get a broad range of the community into gay health action became slightly difficult.
And I just see a question come through. And by the way, to people listening out there, we can, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them into, I think it's the chat function or under the Facebook thing, and they'll be fed through to us. I see a question here from Patrick McDonough, who's asking how important was contact with international AIDS organisation? He said he's thinking here of Dr. Glenn Margot and the Terence Higgins Trust. If anyone wants to take.
Yeah, I mean, it was very important in the early days. It was where we educated ourselves from, in a sense, primarily from America, which is where most of the information was happening. So we did look to gay men fighting AIDS and so on in America, and the Shanty Project in relation to the budding program. And obviously Terence Higgins Trust, in terms of their manual they produced, was phenomenally important in terms of how we were both formulating and structuring our information campaigns. There was also a development of both British and Irish networking and European networking. And at one point, I was involved in a network of voluntary organizations in AIDS and HIV, which was an organization that brought together voluntary organizations from both Britain and Ireland to host an annual conference, to share information, develop kind of lobbying platforms and so on, and would regularly go to conferences in Britain, London, Newcastle, whatever. My partner at the time was a member of Eurocastle, which was the European one, and that was the European AIDS Service Organization. And he ended up going to conferences in Paris and Prague and so on at the same time. But they were largely fulfilling the same function of cross-fertilization of ideas. And we were able to feed back gay health action information and literature, which were highly prized and regarded in those groupings, and some people modeled their own information campaigns on what we were doing here, particularly our success in balancing that sex positive message with the health advice kind of component. So it was that cross fertilization is very important. It also kind of kick-started Cordia, because there were two doctors from the Shanty Project who were attending the World Health Organization in Dublin conference that was held at the time. I think this was 86 or 87.
And they delivered the training at Trinity.
Yeah, so we invited them to meet with us and to provide us with this information kind of weekend, which was really phenomenal training, because it was experiential. They kind of took us through both the philosophy of what they were doing and also the practicalities of the support for people with AIDS in their own home in the States. And, it was this consciousness raising kind of component about it. How did we all feel about our sexuality? We were all big about consciousness raising in the 80s. But it was a phenomenal thing. And out of that, Cordia was founded, so we decided to try and repeat the Buddy project in Ireland and called it Cordia.
And I think I came across a reference as well in one of the, I have it here, actually. So I came across a reference as well to your support of, there was a guy, people might know of him, Simon Nkola in South Africa. He was an LGBT and an AIDS activist in South Africa. And there was a fundraiser held in Dublin in '87, which we're supporting. So it was also practical kind of support for international groups as well. And that was going on. Yes, Cathal.
Yeah, actually, well, I just, as a matter of fact, I was one of the main organisers for the fundraiser, because what happened was that Simon was an anti-apartheid activist with the ANC, and the Democratic Front. He was in prison, and there was a call internationally for support to write. So I wrote to him and ended up having a correspondence with him over the next 5 years when he was in prison, when he came out. And Ciaran Rose and myself were in Vienna at an International Lesbian and Gay Conference, Association ILGA conference in 1989, and we met with Simon there. For what it's worth, I can send it on to you, or I'll put, I can't put it up there. I can put up a link to a drive. The correspondence I have actually ended up in the Irish Queer Archive. So it's there. I had forgotten about it in '92 when I left Ireland to go to Amsterdam. I donated a whole load of stuff to the Hirschfeld Archive as it was at the time, and then became the Irish Queer Archive. So those letters are there. So I can, I'll see if I can put it up on the link in a minute, the chat in a minute. That I've digitized it myself because they haven't. So I've transcribed it and things so people can see the correspondence if they want to of the whole thing. But yeah, it was part of we responded as well to the international, and AIDS in Africa was a huge issue. And as left-wingers, we tried to raise that and try to bring it aware as well, because that was a big crisis issue. But of course, it was very difficult.
And I just see something here from the Q&A section from Eamon Summers, where he said it was wonderful the Gay Health Action was set up. I'm not sure of the dates, but after I came back from the International Gay Association in Washington, D.C. in '82, the NGF's Tuesday talk shop discussed AIDS and had a couple of guest speakers, including Dr. Eamon. I don't recall his second name. He strongly advocated the use of condoms. If any of you remember the talk. I think that international work was actually quite important. I think the Terence Higgins Trust as well, some of the information that you would have used in leaflets would have come from the Terence Higgins Trust. One of the things that when I was interviewing some of you for my project come out was that the implications of AIDS in Ireland, on HIV and AIDS in Ireland, on gay activism more generally during the 1980s. And some people have said that, it kind of put a hold on a lot of gay activism. And I was wondering if anyone would like to speak to that kind of idea. Maybe Ciaran or Bill.
Well, I don't know. I think it had the opposite effect, actually, because I think it was a catalyst for politicizing people and getting involved in it. I mean, we published, from the collective's point of view, we published out for ourselves Lives of Irish Gay Men in '86. And excuse me, by then, we'd had the experience of Gay Health Action for nearly 2 years by then. And so in that book, excuse me, we outline, a brief history, not by any means an academic work, but a brief history of the organizations that we knew of at the time. And there's a phenomenal amount of organizations that are listed in that as providing supports, not just in Dublin and Cork, but throughout the country. There were various organizations which at the time would have been very difficult for any organization to hold meetings and so on outside of the bigger cities in Ireland. So it's a phenomenal amount of activity that was going on. And while the collective did peter out at 85, 86, we were still involved in the various campaigns. There was a Stop the Criminal Justice campaign, there was the divorce campaign, there was the anti-abortion campaigns. All of those kind of campaigns had us involved in them. So there was as I was saying earlier on, kind of cross-fertilization, but also politicization of the community within that. And I think the work on law reform did continue within the the NGF and LGF behind closed doors initially, and that subsequently became subsumed into Glenn, when Glenn sort of took all of that over, really. So I think there was lots of things happening that enabled the movement to expand beyond the issue.
I just see here a very interesting question, actually, that I should have asked Ciaran earlier, which is, it's from Judith. She says, Ciaran, you mentioned religious groups are often at the forefront of radical change. And I know you were the Gay Health Action representative on the Catholic Church AIDS Task Force. She's wondering, was there much collaboration between this task force and Gay Health Action?
So I was that kind of out gay man who was also practicing Catholic, to the dismay of both sides of that phenomenon. So and so my absolutely wonderful LGBT friends would go, "You're a what?" And and for me it was an enormous struggle for many years. And so yeah, I volunteered to go onto the task force. Um, no, I think what did result from it was some um, genuinely sensitive service provision that was either funded by or developed by, church groups. But at the same time, they couldn't consider, saying to anybody that same-sex relationships were like life affirming, that they were normal, etc. And but like for me, interestingly, I stopped being a Catholic because of the misogyny in the church. I mean, I'd put up with their, you know, lily-livered approach to gay sexual orientation for most of my life, but in fact, I now think it's just an intrinsic, as they call us intrinsically disordered. Well, I think they're an intrinsically misogynistic organization, and I left. Mind you, not that many years ago. I only stopped being a Catholic about 6 years ago. So, so so, I mean, I think, as often is the case, there were members of church groups who responded to societal issues, uh, you know, and delivered services. I mean, I was only ever once or twice in Sacred Heart House because I'd moved to London. Um, uh, I don't know that I'd have really wanted to go there had I been a person living with HIV, in Ireland at the time. So, but at the same time, I spent 10 years working at London Lighthouse, and a whole bunch of our volunteers were people from religious life, mainly sisters, and they were amazing. You know, we had this fantastic photo of Anglican sisters handing out condoms outside, outside St. Pancras train station, and they were kind of going, what's the point? Like, what's the problem? This is going to help save lives, you know, so sometimes pragmatism won, but I think many people of faith were really let down by their churches. So yeah. So.
It's probably fair to say, though, that from the collective point of view and Gay Health Action, we did have a strongly separated church and state philosophy.
Yeah, totally.
And I would maintain that to now, just in case you think we were cozying up to
No.
priests at the weekend. So it was really out of necessity that negotiations with the various religious organizations happened. It wasn't that we were chummy with them. It was, in an attempt to kind of ameliorate any of the horrors that they might do if they didn't have access to some of the information. Yeah. How successful we were in that, I don't know, but certainly in setting up the HIV support center, Sacred Heart House, which was funded by the Catholic Diocese, we were able to feed into that in terms of how the community service should be structured in a non-judgmental way and so on, and ended up kind of winning that battle of that discussion. So it was worth being involved in those discussions to try and tailor some of the organizations, but still we prefer that they were state rather than church-led.
Could I just mention that we also had a lot of support and allies in the media, because Charles Self in 1981 had been a designer in RTM, was brutally murdered, and we in the collective led a fight back when it was turned into investigations of the gay community. So we met some of the RTE colleagues at that time, and then also at the same time as Rock Hudson was sort of in Ireland. Vincent Hanley was very famous. I can't think of a good example, but it would be like one of the major singers now, but he was a leading media figure, and he was presenting an MTV American program, and he was semi-openly gay, but also he was the first prominent Irish person to die of AIDS, and I think that was about 1986. But a lot of people who in that kind of milieu of the media and entertainment, they supported us with fundraisers, but they were also very supportive with getting us onto publicity, onto programs in RTE and things like that, which helped. That did help raise the profile. One of the things that also, just to lead on to when you talk about future politics, is that Bill's former partner, who's dead now, unfortunately, Christopher, and myself in 1988 joined Ciaran Rose and Don Donnelly and a few others in founding Gay and Lesbian Equality Network, which led on in '93 to decriminalisation, as Judith mentioned at the beginning. But the reason we did that was because we saw in Gay Health Action that the anti-gay laws, which we thought were just a joke in a way and were just sort of a sign of reactionary, were actually helping to kill gay men. And that David Norris was right. We needed to change those laws as a matter of urgency. So we got involved in both. And then, as you say, Glenn went on to change. And the other one I'd say that it helped is that AIDS, sounds terrible now, but AIDS made homosexuals visible. You know, when you were dying of AIDS and you went back to your family, you couldn't hide it. So suddenly one of the things, it's a bit like marriage referendum in 2015, you know, talk to your grandma. This was not as nice as that, but it was actually that suddenly people were confronted with the reality of, oh, that teacher is gay, that uncle is gay, that nephew is gay, that brother is gay, because they couldn't hide it. And they were forced out of the closet, if you wish. And that led to a visibility which changed attitudes as well, for the positive as well, you know.
Cathal, I mean, I have a slightly different view to that, in that I think the forced outing as a gay man, I think, actually increased the stigma both of being perceived to be gay, and, for instance, the whole issue, problems of getting employment or getting mortgages or bank loans, etc. And remember that initial question, it used to be, did you ever have gay sex, or were you ever tested for HIV? Not have you ever tested positive for HIV, you know? So, like, certainly in London at the time, there was a whole series of adverts saying to gay men, how do you present as straight when you're going to the bank for a loan? And all these things that, well, of course, if you're a gay man, we always have perfectly aligned sideburns. Let one grow down longer, etc. You know, I mean, taking the piss about, you know, gay men's grooming, but it was really, you know, actually addressing a very serious point that so many guys, in particular with men, and you know, were just petrified as being identified as being gay because of what could happen to, you know, their career, etc., etc., because of the whole association with HIV as well, you know. So I think you're right, it did lead to greater visibility, but it also, I think, led to, like, huge fear and anxiety among our community as well, you know. So yeah.
There is also something I'd like to just ask you about your experiences as activists in Gay Health Action, because when I've looked at, you know, reports from your meetings and publications that you're producing, I mean, you seem to have spent an incredible amount of time at meetings, doing things. I mean, so presumably, so Gay Health Action existed for, you know, 5 years, around 5 years, but it must have had, like, a real impact on your day-to-day life and on how much you could actually live your day-to-day life with all of these things. I wonder if any of you have a reflection kind of on that experience.
Well, I remember saying if I could knit, I could have run a cottage industry just from the bloody meetings we used to have. And there was also a sense among a few of us, Jesus, we're fighting for all these rights, but we don't have any time to fucking go and enjoy them ourselves, you know. So there was a bit of that, you know. And at the same time, I really do remember the 80s as a time when I went clubbing a lot as well. But we did spend an inordinate amount of time at meetings.
But also, well, also we integrated it. Like Christopher and Bill were in a relationship, so that, and they were great hosts. They would actually host the meetings, so that we didn't always sit in cold, empty rooms. We sat in this lovely room in Grannell Rahman's, where Christopher and Bill would host us, you know, and we would even have wine at these meetings. So it wasn't we made it as comfortable as we could for ourselves, and it was informal. But also we integrated into lives. Like, for instance, one of the workers was actually I was in a relationship with one of the workers for a few years as well. And also, it also integrated in other ways. I was a librarian for AIB at that time, from 1984 to 1990. And I used to actually do the press cuttings when they had action at work, because I did the press cuttings on the banking system every morning from the papers. And I used to, at the same time, do the ones for anything about prominent about AIDS. So it became kind of just, you didn't even notice it. It just dominated your life, and you just did it. Now, by the time we finished, I was burnt out in 1990, sort of thing. As I say, in 92, I went off to Amsterdam. So it did have its toll as well. It wasn't.
Yeah, I remember that. We used to joke that, well, you always knew what you were doing on Saturday. You'd be going on a march. You didn't know what march was going to be, but it was going to be one. And it was always, say no to X. We had debates about never being on the yes side until finally divorce came along and we could say yes to divorce. But I think it was about taking the clause out of the Constitution, so we were able to say yes to that finally. But I mean, we had fundraisers, and we had fundraisers for ourselves. We had fundraisers for the anti-amendment campaign. We had fundraisers for the divorce campaign. We had fundraisers for Simon and Coley. We had fundraisers for the miners. And these took place in various places. And we also, I don't think we ever had meetings here, Cathal, but we did host a lot of gay collective socials in our house. And I think the social side of the group was very important, because it allowed a lot of the discussion become embedded with us, so that we were clear about our positions, each other's positions, where the nuances were in the politics and so on. And we could do it in a comfortable and safe environment. They were very much different, the meetings I remember. When there was a conference in Dublin in whenever it was, 83, I remember, and there was meant to be a social afterwards, and the organizers couldn't get the venue to agree to host, an LGBT conference social. So we ended up offering the house. So it was completely mad to have, I don't know how many people were at the time. Every square foot of it was done, and the cleanup took weeks. But the social component of it was incredibly important for us in terms of an outlet, because it was every night of the week you were at a meeting, and every weekend you were on a march. So you had to fit in the social at some point.
And for me, that was really important. I had been aware of the gay sock at UCD, and then later at Trinity, introducing fun, because I thought just because you're gay doesn't mean you're going to want to sit around bemoaning the fate of gay people in Ireland. So I introduced Irish coffee afternoons in both universities, and they were the crack, and it meant that lots of other people came along as well, because they wanted to A, show solidarity, and B, you could get a really good, strong Irish coffee with real whiskey that I used to buy on the way into college on a Friday morning, from Quinsworth and Bagot Street kind of thing. And it was that thing of, okay, let's actually just have good fun with each other as well, and I think that's about promoting, that's about developing, and our resilience and our self-esteem, So.
I'm kind of conscious. I think I'm wondering, Judith, are we time that we have to start finishing up because we're running over?
Yeah, sorry, we're just in the background saying we could listen to you all night. This is such a fascinating conversation, and it's such an important conversation as well to capture all of this. But yeah, I think we should probably wrap up. We're a little bit over time. So I'd just like to say thank you so much to James and to Bill, Ciaran and Cathal. Really has been fantastic, and we're totally honoured to have you here. If you've any last comments or last thoughts, you're more than welcome to share them before we finish up.
I see there's a question there from Patrick about Christopher's involvement in the trade union movement. I'll just confirm that is the case. Again, in the collective, we had decided that we'd all come out in our trade unions, which was the important part. And we had developed, a motion to put down at our annual conferences that would support LGBT rights in the workplace. And most of those movements were successful. And in the end, we brought the motion largely under Christopher's direction to ICTU. And he was similarly involved in changing the European legislation to include sexual orientation as part of the recognized rights of LGBT people in Europe. And there's a researcher in contact with me just before Christmas to see if I'd had any documents that would support that. And I did, but I had just given them in to the National Library of Ireland. So they're going to take that out. So the Irish contribution to that progress will be recognized in the research that he's doing, which I think is a wonderful legacy to have.
But to add on to that, I think of the trade union aspect, in '87, when there was a kind of a question over the renewal of the SES scheme workers, I believe it was the LGSPU, the union lobbied quite heavily to get them renewed for that.
Yeah, yes, we had strong supporters in the unions, people like John Mitchell in IDATU as well, and I'm trying to think of the names now. But the actual instant of what happened is the unions were very strong. This was an agreement that was negotiated between the government, the employers, and the trade unions. And the Minister for Finance at the time was Bertie Ahern. And when they came into the room to negotiate, the item of Gay Health Action's SES scheme came up, and suddenly everybody, the unions were right, let's go on with it. And then suddenly this person spoke up and said, excuse me, Minister, I'm here from the Department of Justice, and we have an objection. This can't go through because it's an illegal thing. The unions just said, Bertie just said, like, well, what's this about? So then the guy sort of said, law, criminal law, blah, blah, blah. And then the union said, we're not going to go on with anything if you're going to behave like this and do this. And then Bertie said, okay, can we take a water cooler moment? We'll have a coffee break. And when whatever he said in the room to the civil servants, when they came back after the coffee break, he said, right, that's agreed, let's move on. So it was the very strong trade union support that actually took no nonsense when it came to prejudice.
Great.
Okay, I think I'm going to have to be the one that calls it. As much as I don't want to, but it's been a pleasure. As I said, thank you so much to all of you for your time. And I hope that we can do this again, maybe have more discussions in the future. There's so much to talk about and so many different rabbit holes we could have gone down in those discussions. But thanks again. And also thanks to our collaborators who are Dublin LGBT Pride, and thanks in the background to Kate Drenand, who's been there doing all the tech all night and just making this run so smoothly. She's not appearing on screen, but I know she's there doing everything. Thank you and good night to all of our audience, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. Take care.
Thank you for organising.
Yes, thank you.